to this event. There is, in order of appearance, there will be Alan Cafferty from the Hamilton University speaking from the New York State in the United States. Magdalena Bernaciak from the American University in Bulgaria, although her name and surname suggest something very different. And Dusan Relic from the Stiftung für Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, although the head of the office in Brussels in Belgium. So with us should be also Agata Domachowska, our co-moderator, but I'm not sure what has happened with the connection. Maybe she will join us soon. Anyway, I have organized this meeting. We have organized this meeting to talk about to critically assess enlargement policy, to look at the mistakes or failures of the enlargement policy, and if possible, to talk about the alternation of the current enlargement policy, which is not an easy question, easy task, and quite a problem. And why we should talk about to make a introduction. Well, since 20 or 30 years, we see political stagnation here in the Western Balkans. The Bosnia problem remains on the table, and so is the Kosovo-Serbia relations. And even that Macedonia has solved some of the bilateral problems, it's still apparently become an issue. And if we look at the economic side of the story, we also see the preservation, or actually degradation, of the Balkan states to the peripheral status. We see progress, there is progress, the Balkan states are developing, but if we take into account, some simple indicators like GDP per capita or actual individual consumption or quality of life index or human development index, we see that the difference between the Western European core and the Balkan states actually sometimes is larger. When we look at the international trade of the Balkan states, welcome Agata Domachowska, join us finally. So when we look at what Dusan Relic mentioned some years ago in Zagreb, when we look at the disbalance in trade, that's a huge problem here. We are looking at the enlargement policy that does not bring the effects that it brought to the, I'm sorry for my English, that it brought to the Central European states that joined the Union in 2004. So why this Western Balkan cannot repeat, why the states cannot repeat the story of the success story, apparently, of the Central European states? Have we missed something substantial, or the public neoliberal discourse does not match reality? So what went wrong? And this and other questions I would like to ask our prelegents today. And I would like to start with the Professor Cafferty from the Hamilton University. What the Western Balkans means for the EU from the political economy perspective? What is it?
Okay, so thank you very much, Jan, for inviting me. And I should start out with a statement of humility, because I'm not an expert at all on the Western Balkans. I did actually follow the war in the 90s and did actually do a bit of writing about it. But since then, I haven't really kept up. So in the spirit of what you asked me, I thought I'd just start out briefly with the statement about critical political economy, because it informs my own analysis And I think it's worth a couple of minutes to discuss this as a prelude to understanding the problems that the EU faces and the Western Balkans face with enlargement. And so if you will, bear with me a couple of minutes.
Sure.
Just to start out, most scholars of the European Union and enlargement have proceeded from a standpoint of either functionalism or constructivism, and I think that neither of these approaches does a very good job of understanding enlargement more generally, not just coming enlargement if it takes place in the Balkans, but also Central Europe itself, which, and I might disagree just a little bit that it's been such a success story. It's been a much more mixed, it would seem to me. But in any case, the idea that through functional integration, there will be a spillover and that markets will eventually promote mutual economic development through comparative advantage and efficient financial allocation, that hasn't really worked. And I'll say something more about that in due course. And secondly, the notion of that political scientists, at least scholars of IR, speak of constructivism, the idea that there's a European ideal and that the sort of spirit of Copenhagen, if you like, that gradually people will align their beliefs in liberal democracy and cooperation. Well, that hasn't worked very well for the European Union, and I don't think there can be too much disagreement with that. Well, there could be some disagreement. We could discuss. A third approach to understanding enlargement and the EU more generally is what scholars call realism or intergovernmentalism, and that is to understand the European Union in terms of power relations and national interests. And there's certainly, in my view, at least a lot more in that. Certainly to understand the EU, you would want to understand Franco-German leadership and even more recently German power, especially in Central and Eastern Europe and indeed into the Western Balkans. But the emphasis, according to, in my view at least, and according to critical political economy, must be more on capital generally and European capital. And that is the fact that enlargement took place in the 1990s in the context of the neoliberal turn in the European Union, the turn towards neoliberal austerity. It led to production chains in Central and Eastern Europe, dominated largely by German capital. And this combination of factors led to the growing problems with democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. And this isn't a condemnation of the EU in principle, but more the misfortune that both, not just Central and Eastern Europe, but also former Soviet Union, in a sense, had the misfortune to make their transition in the neoliberal era. Had it happened sooner, it would have been in a much more Keynesian, embedded liberal direction. So the question would be, why was there no Marshall Plan for Central and Eastern Europe? Why weren't the kinds of policies that were carried out with respect to Germany and Western Europe in the 40s and 50s, and even in the 60s, not carried out in Central and Eastern Europe? So very briefly, just let me sketch out what and I know Jan's been reading the chapter, what my co-author Magnus Reiner and I identified as the three stages of enlargement. The first being shock therapy, rapid privatization. The second, in the late 1990s, the phase of foreign direct investment, multinational corporations entering into Central and Eastern Europe But this led not to autonomous development so much as dependent development, and again, largely under German capital auspices. Alongside this came demographic shocks, an enormous brain drain from the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Greece also, although of course Greece coming in later. And just to quote a statistic from Thomas Piketty, the annual flows, net transfers from the EU were not from west to east, but actually have been from east to west. Between 2010 and 2016, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia received the equivalent of 2% to 4% of their GDP in EU funds. But the flow of capital exiting these countries over the same period was between 4% and close to 8% of GDP. And I could go on with this, but it's of course crucially important. So I think what this points to is that sure, cohesion policies have been good, but they have their limitations. So then finally, what's the relevance to the Western Balkans? Looking at it somewhat as an outsider, it doesn't look to me like there's any chance that any of the Western Balkan countries are going to enter into the EU. Serbia doesn't seem to be on the road now. I know it's been a candidate country for some years, but here, if anything, the politics is really in command. There still is a lot of money flowing from the EU into the Western Balkans, but again, those production chains are existing in at least some of the Balkan countries as well. Of course, when we turn to Bosnia and Herzegovina, more political problems. I'm aware of the Slovenian paper that suggested maybe a revision of borders in both Serbia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. That certainly doesn't augur well for any kind of enlargement. So I think I'll leave it at that. I know I've said a lot. Some of it's probably maybe somewhat controversial, but I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. That's important that we hear this, objective assessment, or the theoretical introduction, critical theoretical introduction to this debate from the other side of the ocean. But if you would like to, in two sentences, or in one sentence, in two sentences, if your son asks you that, what's the enlargement policy? What would you say to him? What is the enlargement policy of the EU?
Well, I would say the enlargement policy is very much one, if not dictated by German capital in particular, it certainly conforms to the requirements of German capital. Obviously, there are geopolitical considerations as well, but the idea that of Copenhagen back in the early 90s that an enlargement was going to be so mutually beneficial and even out development, that simply has not happened. So power relations within the EU are the dominant force.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You have mentioned also the European capital and the failure of the building of European idea and collateral damage produced by the market-driven economies and the liberal economies. And I think I would like to invite now Magdalena Bernaciak, who could share with us her research results about the about this issue. Could you please tell us something more about the negative sides of the enlargement policy in Poland, except of the obvious the positive ones? But what were the costs?
Let me just, all right. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jan, for the introduction. Thank you, Alan, for the setting the scene, to which I will actually sort of sneak without indeed too much clash with what you have said. Perhaps I will outline and highlight certain aspects indeed from the perspective of the events and implications of the Eastern enlargement rounds, maybe also trying to draw parallels to the Western Balkan process. I have prepared the PowerPoint, which I think I could share. It's not too long and it's not too wordy. So, and there is a couple of graphs that I wanted also to share with you. So maybe I will just put this as a background with the caveat that, you know, it's not really something that I would like to kill you with at this point. Of the day. However, I think that will still help me illustrate certain points and highlight others. So, I mean, it sounds pompous and it sounds a bit too ambitious to speak about, you know, costs and consequences of Eastern enlargement in 10, 15 minutes. There are volumes about it, and rightly so. I mean, it's not something indeed to be covered so quickly. So I will just highlight a number of aspects, which, as I said, will very much link to what Alan was saying. So yeah, when we come to the negotiations or the setup that led to Eastern enlargement of the EU, this is by definition the way the current enlargement structure, or the structure of the enlargement process has it, a deeply unequal relation. No? So in general, in relation to accession talk, it is a bit of a sort of misnomer to speak really about negotiations. That's not a process in which you can bargain over the contents. You might postpone certain things through transition periods, but it's not a process in which you can bargain over a key. You accept it or you don't. So by definition, this is not an equal process. This process, perhaps in the Eastern, and also, as I will mention towards the end of the talk, Western Balkan phase of the accession or membership talks is perhaps also accompanied by two other important trends. So there is a huge, and there was a huge economic gap between the candidate countries by then and the rest of the EU, gap that was bigger than in any previous enlargement rounds, including the Southern European ones in the 80s. What was also quite specific in this period of Eastern European countries' approximation of the EU, late 90s, 2000s, was that indeed, even though the benefits indeed were to follow on both sides, open market for the EU, stability in the region, they were still, given these two actors, relatively higher on the sides of the Eastern European countries. They had more to gain and they had more to lose if they did not join the EU. In political sense, in economic sense, that was something that indeed these countries craved for at that point, and EU knew it. So in a way, the relationship could be structured even more asymmetrically between these two actors. These levels of interdependency put Eastern European candidate countries to a disadvantage, perhaps even more than in any previous enlargement rounds, due to the high stakes that this accession entailed for them. So that made EU indeed a sort of an even bigger actor than, or the even more powerful actor than what we have seen in previous enlargement rounds. And indeed, it allowed EU to set the modalities of EU enlargements in this particular rounds very much to its favor as it saw fit. And indeed, we saw it very much in the strategy that I thought quite a lot this morning how to actually call, but I called it liberalization played safe, in a sense of indeed sort of opening except areas in which indeed something could happen to actors represented by the EU, in all member states. And these little safeguards we could clearly see being put in Europe agreements in relation to sensitive sectors, where general liberalization was accompanied very much by sort of limitations put on such industries as steel, agriculture, where indeed Eastern European countries could have comparative advantage. We saw it also in accession treaties in relation to free movement of people. So yeah, it was perhaps a sort of cautious approach to liberalization still, I would argue. Maybe not the most prudent if we actually see about and look into the economic rationale of this. This was not so much the result of objective threats posed by Eastern European countries to Western European economies, but indeed perhaps very much in line with Alan saying, a reflection of certain special interests, specific sectors that indeed would perhaps be put under threat, and to a large extent public fears shared by Western European societies that their politicians in the West did not want to basically go against. And that was very much reflected in these selective liberalization, which certain sectors were not included due to these special interests and fears which were prevalent within the Western European societies, and which, as I said, politicians were not so eager to go against. So indeed, a sort of very, very unequal process, and process in which liberalization was really sort of the game of the day, the game to play, however, with certain safeguards that favored actors on the side of the EU. Now, what was then the consequence, or how this liberalization, in what way and how it opened the economies of the East? As Alan said, that was mainly due to inflows, capital inflows to the region in two different forms. That could either take place through sort of financial integration or through more tangible foreign direct investments, especially going to Visegrad countries, to Slovenia. In this sense, given that we did not really speak about, you know, any sort of capitalist traditions in the region, this was a very much sort of imported model of development, and something that Bol and Greszkowicz, escaping very much these categories of liberal, you know, coordinated market economy that were very foreign to the region, that had not featured capitalist development before the transition, was referred to as a special transition, transnational variety of capitalism. These inflows were sort of facilitated or enabled by a number of factors. On one hand, these countries accepted the key, offered a stable environment for these particular types of industries to, and these particular forms of capital inflows to take place. But we also could see some elements of two other let's say important sets of factors in play. One was the follow the leader type of strategy followed by investors. Nobody wanted to be sort of ripped off the benefits of entering these markets and either taking benefit of local demands in the case of market seeking investments, or local comparative advantages in the case of more efficiency seeking investments. So indeed, that was basically the bulk of economic activities within the region, were in a way, as Alan already suggested, sort of steered from outside. And thanks to perhaps on one hand, favorable regulatory environment and this kind of investments strategies and advantages offered by local economies. Now, how did it play in specific sectors? I wanted to talk perhaps a bit more in detail about two segments or sectors that I examined in more detail during my research about on sort of economic consequences of EU enlargement. For manufacturing, I chose the automotive sector, and I also would like to speak a bit about the service sector and the international road transport that I looked into a bit more in recent years. So yeah, when it comes to automotive sector, it's indeed a kind of very often presented as a miracle of, you know, success story of foreign investments, indeed, with a happy end in the region. What we can see is that indeed local advantages played a very, very big role here. So we had accumulated skills still from the time of, from before the change, with certain traditions regarding in vocational training, workforce released through the restructuring processes and available for the investors to be picked up literally from the street. And of course, the low costs of production and wages far below the Western European region. Many investors in this sector followed the leader strategy, and indeed we had, as a consequence, sort of, let's say, a concentration of automotive production in a particular region at the border of Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, and parts of Hungary. And indeed, over time, this sort of, very much investor-driven development resulted in expansion of very decent, when it comes to value-added indicators production, very much oriented towards exports. If you could see, oh, sorry, here's something jumped. Basically, within the 5 years after more or less the beginning of sort of the entrance of investors in these sectors into the Central Eastern European economy, they managed to basically reach the value added, the exports from these countries reached the value added level of other automotive producers in Europe, arguably not Germany, but still they caught up with Southern Europe, they caught up with France, and at some periods even surpassed it later on. So basically similar trends could be observed also in other parts of the or sub-segments of the sector, not only vehicles, but also parts really saw a sort of growing share of high value added production in the region. So you could indeed use the local skills, you paid a bit less for that, and you still could have the same cars and parts coming out of Eastern Europe. Is it a miracle? I'm not sure. I mean, if we think there is also, in a way, a downside to the miracle story, or something that's not all that shiny. So it's still, as Alan mentioned, a kind of dependent development. So it's not really that strategic decisions are made in the region. They are made in companies' headquarters away from here. I mean, we are happy to have the Opel. Today, we're happy to have the new Astra model, but then, you know, it might not be the case in 4 years, and we will have absolutely no influence on what decision will be taken by the company. The same goes for R&D. These are claimed to be indeed very, very limited, as so research and development practically doesn't take place in the region, in the sector, perhaps with some exceptions of Skoda and Dacia. But still, this is not really something, again, locally added or locally produced. For the same, in a similar manner, spillovers are relatively limited, and all the success story that we're talking about really sort of concentrates in regional sort of islands of prosperity in regions in which anyway we already had, you know, before the arrival of investments, relatively higher levels of industrialization. So in a way, these type of FDI, much as, you know, it could, on the level of sort of in terms of sophistication of the production, sort of reached up Western levels. It is not really the same as having, you know, a sort of homegrown big companies of this kind starting and sort of producing, deciding, and researching on your territory. Much as this is perhaps, you know, giving these regions a chance to develop, it also leaves the rest of the countries pretty much untouched. Now, when it comes to the transport sector, the story is a bit different, I would say. Here, we also very much capitalized on local advantages. We had the skills from communist times, like really quite big sectors in each and every country of the region, especially given the fact that at that time, very often the transport sectors in Eastern European countries before the transition served as a sort of carrier of goods also from west to east, so a sort of bridge between the Western Europe and Common countries. That's developed into a big set of skills, but also know-how that was present there. Costs are lower here again, and this connection of this number of advantages basically led to a steady expansion, or enabled a steady expansion to EU markets in a form, again, of sort of production chains, but something in which Eastern Europe has been sort of, from the domestic resources that it built upon, increasingly present. And indeed, we can see it in the data when we go into, you know, recent developments in terms of the volumes of goods transported. Eastern European carriers managed to grow despite the crisis and against the trends which are present there for Western European countries. So this expansion is in a way building upon very much on previous advantages, and in a way benefiting from the liberalization trends in the EU, but it's also meeting several obstacles related to the fact that, you know, this liberalization played safe, not played perhaps at the beginning of the transition in relation to this sector, enabling its opening towards Eastern European competition is now basically subject to regulatory changes that limit the competitive advantages of Eastern producers and can limit their presence in the market. So taking the whole things and you know, bringing these two examples against the trends, the broader trends towards asymmetrical relationship, this idea about, let's say, sort of Western leverage and public fears, do we see similar tendencies in relation to Western Balkans? And this is really my last slide. So indeed, what's similar in the Western Balkans current EU path is indeed the gap in the economic potential, just like before the Eastern enlargement, and the fears regarding the consequences of EU enlargements are very much present in relation to the Western Balkan region, just as they were, or maybe even to a greater extent that they were present before the Eastern enlargement. If we see the support for enlargement, we see that basically most of sort of old member states' populations are nothing but optimistic about the idea of enlarging the community and supporting the new member states, which might likely then lead to the leaders playing this liberalization played safe strategy, this time just as they did it in relation to the Eastern enlargement group countries. Now, what's different, and this is really my last slide, the socialist time local advantages, especially in relation to skill structures, are fading away. On one hand, they are not being perpetuated. The vocational training systems do not work as they did perhaps out there, and also the sets of skills which we need today are very different from those in the past. Similarly, this follow the leader trend is not there anymore. The investors already made their choices in the region. They are sort of happy there, and markets of Western Balkans are not all that big, given also the economic position of the countries. So in this sense, these two trends would not be present and would not play the same role in attracting investments as they did in the past. What is different is perhaps one more thing which I wanted to highlight, and this is indeed the presence of other actors in the region, their political economic presence, which in principle could raise Western Balkan leverage, having a sort of alternative to EU, and in this way basically raise the bargaining position of Western Balkans vis-a-vis the EU. But again, these type of relationships developed with the big non-EU actors are very much, again, based on this very unequal relationship. So I don't really see to what extent they could be used as a blackmailing device or a sort of bargaining device with the EU. EU knows very well that these countries are indeed sort of the weaker side of these alternative relations, and that are also very controversial investments among their societies. So might not be basically the factor that might raise the Western Balkan countries' bargaining position with vis-a-vis the EU. So to sum up with one sentence, some things are the same, some things are worse. So on the whole, it seems that basically the situation and the prospects from the economic point only of Western Balkans are, given the current game and the states and the rules that are being played, it's a weaker position even than the already weak at that time Central Eastern European countries. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you very much. I have this bad feeling, just Dusan, don't quote me in Brussels, that the Central European states taking into consideration where the investments went and where the capital has been directed, that taking this into consideration, we are actually competitors, Central Eastern Europe and the let's say former Yugoslav countries, that we have overtaken the semi-peripheral position of the former Yugoslav countries, you know, and actually we are competing, we are more competitors than cooperators here. Might be this way, unfortunately. But I think Agata has a question, short question for Magda.
Yeah, thank you. If I may, Ms. Brunacek, thank you so much. But I would like to look at the enlargement policy also from a different angle, and I would like to bring up another issue. I'm thinking about the social dimension in the EU enlargement, and the question is it missing? And has the European project in the Western Balkans delivered social change? What is your opinion on it? Thank you so much.
I mean, in relation to Eastern enlargements, of course, this was something that has been put on the table, and especially sort of socially oriented actors in the countries saw EU as one possible and maybe only possible hope to sort of exert pressure on the governments to induce such change. But studies show that this social dimension has, and a sort of conditionality and also a key that had to be adopted as part of the sort of social EU social acquis did not really have too much of an effect, and sometimes even it had a paradoxically contradictory or sort of opposite effect on standards in the region in relation to particular aspects of family, parental leave policies. This actually reversed the developments or made them worse. So I would say that you know, acquis was there. Indeed, it was adopted, but it has not changed too much, and it was not the driving factor for significant improvements across the region. So I don't really expect anything of that sort to take place in the Balkans either. So I wouldn't take this as an option, especially that in the Eastern enlargement, many countries used the lower standards as a sort of competitive factor. So it was rather sort of compromising with social dimension that enabled them to perhaps attract certain, you know, part of these investors, rather than you know, advertising themselves as social and taking this as a kind of you know, attracting factor. So paradoxically, this is indeed the case, and many companies that came to the region actually did exactly this because they were free from the constraints that they had in their own countries. I mean, 2 years ago, I had a person who worked as a union organizer in Estonian financial sector, and I said, so who are the worst employers? And he says, yeah, Swedish banks. So in a way, that's also indicates, you know, indeed, sort of, yeah, that in many cases the decision to invest was really guided by the desire to escape, maybe to have room for experiments on new practices that you wouldn't be able to start with at home. Maybe after some time, it would be possible to transfer some of them, but not as a, yeah, not the opposite. So, yeah.
Thank you, Magdalena. That's a little bit sad. That some time ago, I think Ivica Dačić, when he was prime minister, he said that one of the greatest advantages of Serbia is cheap labor. You know, and just following this logic, we should start working for free. Maybe, you know, he didn't. So now we move to Dusan. And tell me, Dusan, taking into consideration this positive yet ambivalent experience of the Central European states from the EU integration and the current preserved economic problems of the Western Balkan states, does the EU is considering these issues when talking in Brussels about the Western Balkans, or everything goes according to the plan since 1993?
Yes, the problem with 5-year plans is that usually they don't work out, but we know this from history. Basically, I could also go home because with most of what Alan has said, I fully agree, and I will be only repeating it, and with quite a lot of what Magdalena has said. Where I would have to, just for a second, because I have a problem with my picture all the time, you know, it's sort of coming and going away. Let's see what's happening. Okay.
We can see you all the time.
Yeah. Your question whether the bureaucracy here realizes that things are not developing the way they should be, or the way in which they would like to have. First of all, the purpose of every bureaucracy is to perpetuate itself. So they don't really bother very much whether the object of the policies is improving or changing. What they pay very much attention to is that within the bureaucratic structure, everything is perceived to be working finely. To give you an example, DG NEAR, or the previous DG enlargement, is an instrument which receives its political guidance from the European Council, where the heads of the governments, of the heads of the states are together. At the end of the day, enlargement policy is not done by Brussels. It's done by every individual state. The examples are many. Remember for how long Macedonia was blocked because of the Greek approach. or what Bulgaria is now doing to North Macedonia, or what Slovenia was doing to Croatia, or what Croatia is preparing to do to Serbia the moment when things become a little bit more realistic. What I'm trying to tell you is that the huge difference between Southeast Europe and Central and Eastern Europe is history. We are dealing here with the results of a war, disintegration of Yugoslavia. And this disintegration has not been fully, what shall I call it? The end game is not quite clear. But this leads me a little bit away from what I actually wanted to tell you at the very beginning. Your question, what in EU enlargement, what went wrong and why? The answer from my point of view is that simply in Southeast Europe, the EU did not put money where its mouth was. You don't do enlargement by producing new enlargement strategies. Enlargement is done in a way that the divergence in the GDP, in the social conditions of societies, are seen to be moving towards the EU enlargement. This is where the legitimacy of the EU model is derived for the population in the region. What the population in the Yugoslav region has seen, with only one exception, and this is Slovenia, what the rest of the people have seen is that they are actually worse off than they used to be before 1991. Because before 1991, the parents could hope that their children would be better off than the parents are. And the children now, if they decide to stay in the region, will be worse off than their grandparents. And then you can see this also through the GDP. Only recently, most of the region has climbed above the GDP level from 1989. So we see 4 decades of really degradation. And people are not stupid. They make a simple calculation. Yeah, they're actually working for free quite often for foreign investors, in the sense that they receive 300 euros or 350 euros per month as a salary or wage. And the rest is provided by families growing produce, food. So in a way, they are really working for free. And the other way is that to attract foreign investors, direct investments, the government is using public funds to fund privileges for foreign investors. And you fill your public funds by high value-added taxes, which are paid by everyone. So the worker who works in Bosch, where is Bosch? In India, near Novi Sad, is actually, through his taxes and through the high prices that he's paying, subsidizing the foreign investor in the region. Very often. Why did all of this develop the way it did? We have history, the outcome of wars, the all-encompassing effects of the wars, which are still not gone, not only economically, but politically and socially. And then you have the EU, which is a bureaucratic model offering political conditions which may or may not be fulfilled. Just look at the Croatian accession to the European Union. Croatian NGOs published before the accession a huge list of not fulfilled criteria. But the political decision in the capitals of Europe was done. Croatia will become a member. And this had geopolitical reasons, and this is how it works. People, and I started with this, especially young people, do their mathematics, see that their perspectives are bleak, and draw the only realistic conclusion. And this is to migrate. And I had recently another view at the figures, together with my colleague Matteo Bonomi from IAE in Rome. And in 2018, 230,000 citizens of the so-called Western Balkan countries, the Southeast European 6, received for the first time a residence permit in the EU. Residence permit is a stay longer than 3 months. because up to 3 months you're traveling visa-free, with the exception of Kosovo. So we had every 2 minutes, one citizen of the so-called Western Balkans arriving in the European Union and usually staying. In 2019, these are the latest figures, there were 250,000 people receiving for the first time a residence permit in the EU. So we had only in 2 years, 500,000 people departing. And if you combine it with a very low fertility rate in the region, Serbia lost last year, no, not last year, 2019, 50,000 people just through the difference between the newborn and the dead, without migration. Then you can see that the political economy of the region has been really degraded on the sale of cheap labor at home and the export of capital outside, with no compensation. And this is the modern difference to Central and Eastern European states. You participate at the cohesion funds. And in spite of the fact that labor is also cheap in Poland and Czech Republic and so on, you receive a kind of a compensation through the European cohesion structural funds and now the recovery fund. I did a calculation with Matteo on this, and we found out that in the next 7 years, the density of the aid, of the flow of zero price capital from the EU to the region, through the structural and cohesion funds, through the agricultural funds, and through the recovery fund, to EU member states in Southeast Europe will be 10 times bigger than what the so-called Western Balkan states receive through IPA monies, if they are going to receive it. In concrete figures, in the next 7 years, each citizen of Southeast European states will receive about 500 euros free capital grants. Greece and Croatia, the citizens of Greece and Croatia will receive between 5,000 and 5,500 euros per capita. Translated into realistic sums, Croatia will receive 20 billion euro free in the next 7 years, and Bulgaria 29 billion euro free. So the difference between Southeast European states and the vicinity is increasing. The chances of picking up are nil. And the realization of this fact among the bureaucrats here, or the bureaucrats in Berlin and everywhere, is there. But you can't say it aloud, because then you would have to say, okay, then we have to make a structural fund for Southeast European states the way we did it for Romania and Bulgaria 2 years before entering the European Union, if we want to give them a push to catch up. This is politically not popular. This is also something outside the thinking of the political class. If you talk to the members of parliament in Berlin and so on, the first reaction is, wait a minute, there is corruption there, just like in Romania and in Bulgaria. And if you point out that the fact that 3 years ago, Romania had the highest GDP growth rate in the world, higher than China at that moment, 12%, then everyone is stunned. And about half of the growth rate of all Central and Eastern European countries comes from the zero price capital coming from the EU. Without this, the whole thing would collapse. The situation is bleak. Things will not change. Alan is completely right. EU membership for the region, just forget it for a long time to come. So we have a political problem for the EU. Sometimes people react here by saying, oh, our ideas are good, but then we have the malign influence of Russia and China in the region. The conspiracy theory starts in Egypt, you know. Everything would work out good if the elites were not so bad and the Chinese and the Russians preventing our good ideas from being fulfilled. And I am not very popular when I say that it's very good that the Chinese are in Serbia, because this provides food for about 20 to 30,000 employed people there and their families. Without the Chinese investments in Bor, which are the copper mines, and Smederevo, the iron mill, the steel mill, this would be closed down. And there would be no jobs there. And this has even attracted investments from Japan, from Korea, and so on. They're not coming because there are special skills by the Serbian workers. They're coming because labor is cheap and the geographical position is good. And also Serbia, through the Stabilization Association Agreement, has almost all exports free to the European Union, and at the same time it can export to Russia and to Turkey and so on. But the other countries in the region don't have this. What does Bosnia have? Nothing, except labor. So we see in the whole region, population drops. Albania lost half of its population since the change of political modes. And we see a situation in which something that Branko Milanovic, the World Bank economist and a great author, called political capitalism spreading. Political capitalism is the model of China and Russia and so on, and even Turkey to a certain extent, which means that you have elites which are really misappropriating social goods, public goods, for their own purposes, and within a capitalist form of production. So the influence of the EU is going back. And Alan, the only point where I disagree with you is about German capital. It's there. It's the most, it's measured with others, it's the most present foreign capital. But the region is of no particular interest to German or any other capital. EU's trade with Southeast European states is 1% of the EU's trade. They can live without it tomorrow. The only interest which still exists is that you have problems to find labor, because in Poland and in the Czech Republic and even in Slovakia, there is not labor. Then you see whether you can find some labor still around in Serbia. And this is where the interest comes on, and also because the subsidies by the government are quite high. So how is this going to finish? I'm afraid that it's nowhere written that the model of enlargement, which was developed at this kairos, at this happy moment, when there was no ideological resistance in Russia or anywhere else, or where the people in the East were mostly happy to become capitalists, and misunderstood this with the promise of better life, of increased social capital for them. It's not written anywhere that this will apply everywhere and by all means. And I'm afraid that we are going to see further strengthening of authoritarian rule. Just look at Mr. Vučić. That we're going to see the EU countries shrinking the way of getting further involved. And the political cost for this will not be very big, because the disintegration of Yugoslavia provoked a war. In this war, the EU and the US, and especially the US, I call it always the Pax Americana, what we have on the ground. All the outcomes were American outcomes, and the EU was the shovel brigade afterwards, taking care of the debris, This danger that conflicts in the region could spill over, pull the EU, break up NATO, almost like in 1999, this is all gone. Because we have now a chain of NATO states from the Baltics to the Black Sea. We have a number of countries in the region, member of NATO, and we see that the possibility of Russia to project military power to the Adriatic is also nil. China is not interested in projecting military powers. China would love to have more EU members which are friendly to China. So I don't see a very big geopolitical competition actually happening on the ground. What we see on the ground is that this model of political capitalism, of authoritarian rule, is spreading, and it finds allies in Central and Eastern Europe, in Hungary, And it's not by coincidence that the new DG commissioner is a Hungarian who has a lot of understanding from Mr. Vučić and the others. We see that what you're having in Poland, the role of the church, the pushing back of the position of women in society and so on. This is something which in Croatia is wholeheartedly supported. Even now in Slovenia, you have now these problems. So the paradigm of EU enlargement is in a way gone. We have a new situation which we are still not really describing or analyzing properly, because we still believe that things might turn out differently. I don't think so. I think that the chaos, the moment of happiness in Europe is gone.
We can, thank you, Dusan. We can ask the question, but I will leave this question open. I have another one that will connect you to Alan again. But we can ask the question whether the EU wants membership of the Western Balkan states if we take into consideration how well economically integrated are the Western Balkans within the EU as the market. This sort of informal membership has been already done, and 1990s are gone, clearly. There is no Germany who needs Poland and Central European markets and stability on its eastern border. So it's not really in anybody's interest. There is Western Balkan market, pardon, and Western Balkans providing cheap labor to the EU, and that's it, basically.
Even if this would disappear tomorrow, it wouldn't make a huge difference at all. The only source of risk was uncontrolled migration. In 2015, when the migration crisis reached Germany, half of the people arriving in Germany were Kosovo and Albanians. So, and in the meanwhile, Germany's labor market is looking for work for people. And if they come from Kosovo and from Albania, this is excellent. Yeah. This is because they're far better integrated into the situation than when they receive people from Afghanistan and from Iraq, who need much more training until they can cope. So only if Hungary would become a Russian ally and Russia could move through Ukraine, Hungary to the Adriatic coast, then the West would immediately offer Serbia membership and Bosnia, and it would be tomorrow solved.
Unfortunately, that's true. You know, one of my friends from Bosnia, from Zenica, told me that apparently we need another war over here to turn
not another war, because
more attention. Well, he mentioned the war, but
only if Russia. I don't want to speak about China. Only if Russia could actually be on the ground, but it can't. So,
Alan, taking into consideration what Dusan said previously about basically not enough money being spent on the Western Balkans, in your book you are mentioning an issue, a topic that is not often linked with the enlargement policy, that is fiscal federalism.
Sorry, Jan, fiscal
federalism.
Did you say imperialism?
No. Federalism. Fiscal federalism. Can you hear me?
Oh, fiscal federalism. Yeah, sorry. This is
my English is not perfect.
Well, you know, and Dusan, I think actually all of us agree with each other about just about everything. And, you know, both wonderful presentations. And I think the absence of fiscal federalism perfectly conforms to this. There hasn't been fiscal federalism in reality. I know there's some talk now over the last 6 months, 8 months, but even then the conditionalities are my understanding at least, are very, very significant and severe. So, you know, you have a monetary union without a fiscal policy. And you know, as I say, that conforms to the general interpretation that we've all had.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have crossed the time. Agata, have you got any questions?
Maybe just one quick and short question, if I may, to Mr. Relic. You've already mentioned this different economic issues and political issue, the problem of rule of law in the Western Balkans, the strengthening of authoritarianism. And I would like to ask for your opinion, whether, to what extent, to what degree, if it's even possible, could or should economic and political priorities of the EU enlargement policy be separated? If it's even possible, would it be a good idea or not? What is your opinion? Thank you.
On the normative level, the EU strategy, enlargement strategy, says that the adaptation of the acquis should go parallel with the increase of economic possibilities for the region. And all the EU commissioners at some point, enlargement commissioners at some point, insist that they are helping the region to develop. You have now Varheli, the enlargement, the engineer commissioner, pointing out that not only that the EU is ready to provide in the next 7 years up to 9 billion euro to the region through IPA 3, for the Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance 3, but that through other means, especially guaranteeing loans, the region might attract up to 20 billion euro foreign loans. And you know, I'm a man with some age, and I remember the predecessors. I remember Mr. Fuller, who used to be Commissioner for Enlargement about 10 years ago, who would bang on the table and say, we are going to enable the region to attract 10 billion euro of foreign loans through guarantee. Our government never happened, and it won't happen, because the region is saturated by loans. Dealing with loans is difficult. All of the countries of the region have an annual fiscal deficit, current account deficit of about 7%. And just like Alan said, as the Central Eastern European country are actually transferring capital to Germany and other places, the region is bleeding capital. All the time you have to pay back your loans. If your fiscal position is quite risky, if you take so many foreign direct investments, which, as Magdalena said, can move tomorrow back or move to Ukraine or to Moldova. So this model of development based on state allowances for foreign investments, on cheap labor, on taking loans just for everything, this doesn't work. And the authorities, the public authorities, are not even capable any longer of managing the loan business. So what the Chinese do when they come and give them key term projects in the region, this is what they love. They sign an agreement with a fixed price, and the Chinese promise in 1 year you'll have a motorway fully finished, you don't have to do anything, we'll give over the keys to you. And most of the time they're successful with this. These are backdoor business deals. There is no transparency about them. In Northern Macedonia, in the previous government, there was a lot of graft in the Chinese businesses. What's happening in the rest, I really don't know, but it's not kosher, simply. But for Vučić government or Đukanović government, It's much easier to deal in this way because an EU loan is difficult, it takes time, there are conditionalities. At the end of the day, you don't want it at all because it will take you so much time. The world is not perfect. And the people will vote again for Vučić and the others because they offer them quick solutions. People from Bosnia, from Macedonia coming to Serbia to get their jabs. Because Mr. Vučić got the jabs from the vaccines, from the Chinese, from the Russia, and he bought them in the West. And now he is the champion of the region in ensuring, for the most of the population, survival. In Sarajevo, presently, more people are dying per day on corona than they used to die during the siege of Sarajevo. So
that's tragic. That's tragic. Okay, I think we reached the limits of the. We enjoyed the benefits of the webinars and the online connection that we could meet as such, and then again we reached the limit that we cannot just go to a restaurant or cafe and continue discussion as it would happen probably during one of the conferences in Sarajevo, Skopje, or Belgrade. But I would like to thank you very much, everyone, for participation. Alan Kafrony from Hamilton University, Dusan Relic, Stiftung für Wissenschaft und Politik, Berlin, aus Brüssel, and Magdalena Bernacik from the American University in Bulgaria, Agata Domochowska and Jan Muś, Institute for Central Europe. Thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon, and I'm sure we'll meet again.
All the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan. It was great to hear everyone. I really, really enjoyed today.
Thank you very much for the meeting and indeed the opportunity for us to talk to each other from hundreds of different places. I mean, it's just crazy still. I'm always amazed. Much as I'm fed up with the Zoom, it's also extra opportunities to hear voices you wouldn't be able to otherwise. Thank you very much.